Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A little request to keep your phones on silent mode. Let's all know what is it that makes the art of Rajasthan so immediately distinctive. We begin our next session, The Arts, Arms and Armour of Rajasthan, presented by Avid Learning. Our guests on stage, B.N. Goswamy, Naman P. Ahuja, Rima Hooja, Robert Elgood, and Yashashwini Chandra in conversation with William Dalrymple. William is one of the founders and a co-director of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival. He has to his credit a number of books, the most recent being Return of a King and Indian Army in Afghanistan. He's won the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award, the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year Award, to just name a few. Over to you, William, sir.
It's always nice to come back to the Durbar Hall because for the first 3 years of the Jaipur Literature Festival, this was it. Then we grew a little bigger. Before we have sessions in this festival, we tend to get all the authors huddling together. Normally they agree with each other and all sort of nod when we say the same things. We've just had the most fantastically spectacular disagreements over the meaning of Rajasthan, which promises very well for the session, and I look forward to stirring it up over the next hour. When people talk about Rajasthan in the rest of India, they have a very clear idea of what they're talking about. They think of a desert state with men with turbans and moustaches, warriors, all that sort of thing. But it's very interesting to look further back to see how early did Rajasthan have a clear self-perception of itself. There are other parts of India which very early on in ancient times think of themselves as units. Bangla, the early Bengal, is there from very early on. There's an very early conception of Tamil identity very early on. But I'd like to ask my first question to the great historian of Rajasthan, Rima Hooja. How early do you get a conception of an area which we today call Rajasthan? When can you point to it that becoming something that was recognized as a unity, a cultural sphere?
I like the way you're putting these 19th, 20th century notions onto this. No, what is interesting is that there isn't one Rajasthan, because people need to now think of present-day Rajasthan is roughly the size and shape of France. So that's one entire country. And in 1947, there were 19 kingdoms, princely states, and 2 chiefdoms. But we do have notions very early on of a jungle area, which is roughly Bikaner. And when I say early, this is the Mauryan period, so 300 BCE plus minus.
Jungle.
Jungle, possibly because it also contains the jungle. There's a notion of the Marubhumi, which is because of the because of the desert sands, it's the land of death, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. There is an area that later, so it's these different time periods which come in, but there's an area which later on becomes a Med path, and it's a flat area, but then it gets associated with people known as the mayors. So places change names, but the old names also live on. It's like layers upon layers upon layers. There isn't a notion of one unit called Rajasthan, and there possibly would not have been, but for other historical things which we will probably come to in due course.
So when we first planned this session, I called it the arms, Rajput arms, art and armour. Yashashwini, you said it was very important not to call it that. What was your thinking? To call it Rajasthani art and architecture rather than Rajput? What was going through your mind when you made that distinction?
So I was very uncomfortable with the title of this panel discussion, which was... So I was very uncomfortable with the original title of this panel discussion, which was the Arts, Arms and Armours of the Rajputs. I was in favor of renaming it of Rajasthan. As Rima ji has pointed out, Rajasthan is a sort of a modern term. I mean, it's a term which describes a modern political administrative unit, right? but it's a convenient term to describe a region that consists of a number of different communities, including the Rajputs, perhaps not perhaps, but in fact historically dominated by the Rajputs. But what has defined this particular region is also the presence of other communities and also intercaste links between these communities and the Rajputs, which are increasingly being looked at. So, which is why I was sort of uncomfortable with the term, because I think when we look at the arts and cultures of this region, we should look at them more holistically, first of all. And second of all,
you made the point that a lot of the artwork was not obviously done by Rajputs.
I mean, I might have been less uncomfortable if it had been called the arts of the Rajput courts, because then it's it sort of limits the focus of this panel discussion is on the courtly arts. But again, that's a problem, because the Rajputs were the patrons. They were perhaps the primary consumers, but this disregards craftsmanship, because a lot of those paintings, presumably a lot of the arms and armors, were also being made and cast by other communities. So I think that is very important.
And a lot of the great art of this literature of this country, again, is from other communities other than
So so of late, there's this fantastic new book that looks at Rajasthan in a very interesting and a different sort of a way, called Nomadic Narratives, by Tanuja, which emphasizes the oral history of the region. I mean, this is a region that consisted of a number of bardic communities, genealogies, sort of panegyric compositions. They were all sort of oral in nature. So it's very important. So a lot of the literature is also being composed by different communities, the Charans, etc. So so if you're looking at the history, the arts and cultures of this region, you cannot just pin it down to any one community, I feel.
And also time. I think somehow this hall is fated with coming up each time with talking about actually the idea of Rajasthan. Yeah. So we've done that, and each time we've come up with new things. Because when we say Rajput, again, we're not necessarily, you might mean the Kshatriya, but you kind of come away and talk about other areas. Yeah, so it's a much wider canvas on which we are actually playing at this point.
Because even Rajputs, I mean at the panel discussion about the 18th century, we were talking about a particular kind of Rajput, the princely Rajput, the Mirza Rajput, as they were described during the Mughal period. But there was also Bhumiya Rajput. Yeah. So I mean, even even for example, the relation between the Rajputs and the Mughals were defined differently. In the case of certain Rajputs, it was loyalty which defined these relationships. In the case of other Rajputs, it was fierce opposition which defined their status as good Rajputs. So it's very complex.
The historian was actually pushing it back to, kind of again back to 3rd century BCE or things, where you have smaller units with a wonderful township at Raid and Sambar and places, and you find little miniature houses, which have fascinated me. I wish I could find out where they are. And then greater overlords somewhere else. And then the same thing comes up in about the 10th century, where you have small kingdoms or units, and then a larger overlord within Rajasthan or away from Rajasthan, even in Kannauj. So that kind of takes us into so many directions.
In the 19th century, you have the British calling this area Rajputana. But so many Rajput courts lie in Bundelkhand or in UP. How did this end up being called Rajputana? And why are the Rajputs associated so strongly with this area rather than, say, the area of Khajuraho or Bundelkhand?
Shouldn't I throw the ball in your court, Willie, and say, wasn't the East India Company responsible? No, but I think the Rajputs are coming to be defined as warriors, even though there are other communities across India who are warriors. And I think a lot of it is to do with the way the political governance starts coming into play. So as you say, there is Bundelkhand, there is Chhattisgarh, there is the Saurashtra and Kathiawar area.
And the hills.
And indeed the hills, where we have our expert who's been working.
Which leads us naturally to BNG. So only last year, BNG, in New York, there was a fabulous exhibition which defined itself as an exhibition of Rajput painting. Does that mean anything?
Not to me. Not to me, really. The term Rajput painting was, shall we say, invented by Kumaraswamy.
In the 1920s?
1916, exactly.
Close.
The 1916. And when he talked about Rajput painting, he was distinguishing it from the better known paintings of that particular time, which is Mughal, right? And of Rajput painting, he wanted to make a distinction between painting done in the hills, which is also Rajput kingdoms, and painting done in Rajasthan, like that.
And do you think there's anything which defines the painting, that unites the painting of the hills and Rajasthan, but is distinct from the painting of the Mughals? If you were asking that question today with all the modern scholarship that's gone on since Kumaraswamy.
You know, I would make a distinction. Not easy to put it verbally, but in my mind, the person who, the style which developed in the various states of Rajasthan, right from Bikaner, Mewar, Marwar, Bundi, Kota, Kishangarh, and so on. What distinguishes this particular work is the capacity for abstract thinking. Whether this abstraction comes from an inhospitable terrain and you turn inwards, so to speak, I don't know. But abstract thinking is what really, to me, is much more prominent in Rajasthani painting than in painting of the Pahadi area. The Pahadi area, about which I know a bit more than I know about Rajasthani painting, is extraordinary in terms of description of states of mind, right? But Rajasthani painting has this sort of extraordinary, let me quote you from something. One of the most important paintings in my mind, and I think in terms of painting, visually, is a painting of the Bihari Satsai. Bihari Satsai, as we all know, is the 700 verses by the great poet Bihari, beginning of the 17th century. And this generally celebrates Krishna, generally. Not everything, but there's a painting I saw very recently showing Krishna playing upon his flute, and he's standing in the center, and there are 2 gopis to the right and 5 gopis to the left. And there's a text of the Bihari Satsai inscribed on the top of the thing. It's an Adhara dharata hari ke parata, ot deet pat jot, harit baas ki bansuri, indra dhanush si hot. The moment, he says, the poet says, the moment Hari, that is Krishna, puts the flute to his lips, all colors start coming down, gathering, the black of his eyes, the red of his lips, the clouds up there and so on, and this little piece of raw bamboo, it has the capacity to turn everything into a rainbow. Now, not only is it beautifully said, but what does the painter do? Towards the right of Krishna, there are 2 gopis, and they are looking with wonderstruck eyes and so on, completely in love with Krishna, and just lost in the vision of Krishna. Behind them, there are trees of different descriptions, different colors that the poet has talked about. But towards the left, there are 5 gopis who are not even looking at Krishna. One of them is pointing in that direction and says, no, look there. And there is a rainbow, but the rainbow doesn't spread from end to end. It's a kind of a narrowed mouth of a cave. Right. And it's extraordinary. I'm sure the painter knew what the rainbows are in the sky, doesn't come down to the earth. They know that the rainbow spreads from end to end and so on. So narrow thing. And I asked the painter, what could this possibly be? Why is the rainbow down here? He said, "Ye to Giri Kandara hai." I was struck. Giri Kandara, in the tradition of bhakti at Nathadwara, where this great painting flourished, they say there is a cave which you enter and you will experience something. You don't know what you will experience. And inside it is dark of that particular rainbow, and the painter's inviting you and me and you to enter that cave of experience. Extraordinary, really extraordinary. Now that is abstract thinking.
Naman, in terms of architecture, again, tourists come to the forts of Rajasthan and very much imagine that there is a coherent Rajasthani architectural style. Do you think it's just a sub-Mughal style that people are describing, or is there something which is definitively and definably Rajasthani or Rajput?
Well, it all depends on what period you're looking at and where you want to ask this question. If you're looking at 17th century renovations to older forts, you'd be hard-pressed to not find an impress of Mughal craftsmanship or building technology or requirements for spaces. But if you're studying gardens, you'd look at something differently. But what I'd like to do is come back to something else that was being discussed about issues of identity formation and historical continuity. If you start looking at what's on temple walls, for instance, that gives you a different kind of a history. There are very clearly the impress of Riti poetry, which informs the Surasundaris that adorn the Rajput temple walls, which are exactly the same things that get picked up in the Rajput painting. So if you don't have that poetic context of knowing what's going on the temples, which is one visual expression of it, then you're constantly stuck by either studying form in art history or you're studying content. If you're studying line and form alone, then of course you're going to start looking at styles that have come where artists have been trained in the court of in the Mughal atelier, and then they've started working in Bikaner, or they've started working in Mewar or wherever else they move to at the early dates, even when you're looking at the Bhagvat and so on. But if you start looking at the subject matter and start looking at iconographic continuities, you'd be able to create a different kind of history of content which looks at different bodies of materials. So in terms of a Rajasthani identity, again, it depends on what nomenclature you're using. So if you're using Chauhan or Chahaman, Parmar, Pratihar, Gurjar, Jejeka Bhukti, which is the region that we today call Bundelkhand, it depends on what terminology you're looking for. So if you're looking at the land of a particular community, there might have been a 10th century vocabulary for these principalities, which was different from a 7th century one, which was different from an earlier one. So it depends on what terminology you wish to use. If you're looking for a history of the word Rajasthan, and then you're limiting yourself. But if you're looking for where the traditions of Rajasthan come from, then you have a much longer durée to look
Willie, just
at.
to jump in on the concept part of it, there is a tradition which comes in sort of maybe 8th century or so, Naman can maybe date it a little more, which is the 5 shrines with a central spine, the Panchayatan, which you find not just in Rajasthan or parts of Rajasthan, all the way from Jaisalmer, but also Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh. So again, we are
extending over the border into Sindh.
And extending into Sindh and what later becomes Bahawalpur and across. And so we are again talking of a sort of roughly larger area, as you say, Jejaka Bhukti, which is, I'm glad you're expanding Rajasthan in that sense, if only conceptually. So again, what is truly Rajasthani, or truly, we are not doing the Rajput just too well, but truly limiting is actually not limiting, it's boundless.
Yashashwini, if one looks at the great oral epics of this part of the world, they also cross borders, don't they? I mean, Papaji, although it's centered in Mawar and Mewar, goes over to Umarkot and into what is now Sindh. Huh?
No, exactly. Even a lot of these communities, which might be considered distinctive to Rajasthan, are also found in Gujarat, Sindh. In any case, this entire region, all the way from Punjab, I feel, including sort of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Sindh, Kutch. I mean, this was a sort of it was a desert area. It was sort of a frontier area. It was defined by a lot of nomadism. Communities were constantly moving. There was a lot of sort of...
Papaji is mobile cowherds, isn't it?
Yes, for example, when we were talking about sort of courtly art traditions, there's also, Rajasthan also has had this wonderful folk art tradition. Pabujing being a wonderful example of an oral epic and an art form, because the oral epic is recited in relation with the fud, the painted scroll.
For those who don't know, just talk about the Papaji Epic and the FUD for just 1 second.
So, the Pabuji is this wonderful sort of larger-than-life epic story which has been very popular in Rajasthan. It's sort of, it's recited by Bhil Bhopas for a largely Raika community, sort of the camel breeding community. But having said that, it's fairly popular because Pabuji is a mythic, is sort of a semi-mythic hero. He's considered of he was supposed to be a Rathor Rajput. So obviously there's also a lot of following amongst the Rajputs. But what is very important is Pabuji is mainly a subaltern. He's sort of a lower caste deity. He's a hero, and and
the epic is, what's fascinating about the epic is, unlike, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey, which is entirely entertainment,
this has a lot of
this
stories.
also has therapeutic qualities. So if you have an ill cow,
Exactly.
you summon the Bopa and you recite the FUD, you recite the epic,
So mostly
and
the
the
camels,
cow and the
mostly the
cow and the
camels.
camel is
So
healed.
the Pabuji's main followers are the Raikas, who are these camel breeding, which is the traditional camel breeding community. So there was a certain efficacy to commissioning a reading of Pabuji's FUD, right? If your camels weren't doing very well or you weren't prospering, you engaged a Bhopa, you commissioned a Bhopa to do a sort of recitation of Pabuji.
It's a lovely idea.
And always minus one stanza. It could vary, but you could never recite the entire thing. That was inauspicious.
8 nights.
You had to omit something, but they still knew it all.
But the point about Papaji is that he represents Rajput values, Shastriya values. He is reputedly the grandson of Rao Aslan, and is known for the 13th century. His great role is saving a herd of cows. He's very famous for this, thought to be a very virtuous thing for a Rajput to do, obviously. But he has plenty of other qualities that represent the Rajputs. And I think, rather than looking at Rajasthan, which is, I think, a mistake, because it is a geographical area that has very little meaning to history, what I think you should be looking at is the qualities that make up a Rajput, the values that are so defining, which become clearer as the centuries progress. And I would suggest that when you're looking at the Rajput, you're looking at, initially, an assembly of warriors from very different places. You've got Scythians coming in, you've got the Hunas coming in, you've got the original Vedic...
White Huns.
The White Huns, yes, the Hunas. The people who survive from the Vedic period, the warriors who the Vanshavalis like to trace their descent back to. And so you've got an amalgamation of people who are fighting to build a society in a fairly savage land. And these are people who come together and establish groups of people who create a value system. And that value system is based on worship of the goddess, of Shakti. And this defines the Rajput much more than the geography. Sorry.
And the weapons.
And of course, central to that, their whole role is based on weapons. And so they worship them, they offer them to the goddess, Shastra Puja, Navaratri, whatever you want to call it. And so their definition is by their actions rather than where they come from. And in fact, the Rathors, for example, come from Kanua, and they're driven out by the Muslims, and they're driven, like many Rajput clans, into the less hospitable parts of India.
So that's a very important point, which is why it becomes possible also to assume this identity, because it is defined by certain values, a certain, right action, a certain way of thinking, certain costumes, certain conduct, certain kinds of diet, marriage practices. Because there are these values that define a Rajput, it's also possible to assume, it's an identity that can also be sort of assumed and remolded and remade over time.
Robert, you've just written a book entitled Rajput Arms and Armour. I asked BNG earlier whether there was something that made sense to call a Rajput painting, and he said basically, no, there isn't. Do you think there's such a thing? Is there a specific thing that you can look at and say that's definitely a Rajput sword?
The difficulty with this is that Rajput swords Sirohi being the main centre of production, Sirohi being the main centre of production, are copied. And so you can buy a Sirohi sword in the Deccan, just as Farangi swords made in Europe are made in also being made in India. So you can buy a so-called German sword from the Deccan. So it's no different really from having a French restaurant in Jaipur. It's much the same sort of thing.
I mean, I think that's a really good analogy, thank you, because I particularly enjoyed reading your book and seeing the complexity and the social history and the anthropology that has been connected with looking at arms and armor. And I think this putting together of form and ritual function that you've associated with a weapon is something that is really quite appropriate, because that's the only way that we finally start understanding what these objects mean. You want me to put it closer?
Yeah. It doesn't work within an inch or two. You've got to all of you keep it right up.
But one question that did come to mind, two questions that I had. Can you easily distinguish women's arm and armor?
The answer to that is no, except it tends to be smaller. And when you have something rather small, you decide it's either for a child or it's made for a woman.
Is there a tradition of teaching women to fight here?
Absolutely, and women are taken to the armory and taught to use weapons and shown the weapons and taught the stories, because the women, of course, teach the children. So that's better. The Rajputs put their teaching not in the hands of the Brahmins, but in the hands of the Charans. And the Charans, who are prepared to go into battle with them, are given the job of teaching their children. They take precedence in the courts, the Mughal courts, over the Brahmins. So they are very, very important, and they establish what is called Rajput Dharma. They set out the rules of what is to happen in the Rajput court, what is good practice for a Rajput. And so in order to make sure that Rajput Dharma is continued, they have total license to say whatever they like, even to be offensive to the ruler, and it is absolutely anathema to kill one. And they trade on this, of course, by delivering luggage and parcels and things in the trade system. And so when they're protecting something, it's a terrible crime for a robber to kill one. But occasionally they are...
They can always threaten to perform chandi, which is take their own life.
They do sometimes commit chandi, and the psychological consequences of the robber are very serious. And there's a very good story about that sometimes.
Let's stick with this idea of fighting women, which I like very much. When I was working on Hyderabad for White Moguls, I was astonished in the 19th century to find that he had an entire regiment of women who went into battle at the Battle of Kardla and saved the men who were floundering under a Maratha attack. Is there any, do we have warrior regiments?
I really don't want to be ungenerous, but I don't think fighting women have a highly successful military life in India. You have them, of
Rima,
course.
come on, fight back.
Hang on, before I finish. There is a good example of the Nizam of Hyderabad, who had a regiment of women, but the one occasion I can think of, they ran away just like the men.
Kardla, they were very successful.
Whether they ran as fast, I don't know, but they ran.
It goes back all the way to Kakatiya women in southern Andhra Pradesh, Telangana.
Of course, from the Rajput point of view, many of the Rajputs must have been Scythian. Certain ideas come in from Central Asia, and you have the Amazons coming from that. One of the great traditions that comes from Central Asia is the notion that it's terribly bad for a warrior to die in bed. That's a Scythian idea, comes from Persia, and the tradition for an old man who'd survived many, many battles would send word to his enemies and say, meet me in such and such a place with as many men as you feel you need. And the two old men would have a drink together, opium water and saffron and whatever, and then they would cut each other to pieces so that they could both get to warrior heaven. It was necessary to die in battle. And most of them did.
Or this idea is Scythian or Rajasthani?
The Scythians then become part of,
Oh yes, no, in a modern Rajput,
Yeah.
and in fact, stillborn male children were cut with a sword, so they too could go to warrior heaven.
You told a lovely story in your launch last week in Delhi about the man who cut the hair off the sleeping.
Yes, the Rajputs have a great tradition of blood feuds. There's a story about a man who climbed into his enemy's house and cut the choti, the lock of hair off the top of his wife's head while she slept, and made off on his horse. And this is a way of showing the people, the man of the house, that he really wasn't the man of the house. He was a feeble sort of fellow, couldn't look after his women. So when he woke up and found this outrage to his honor, he got on his horse to track his enemy and kill him. Meanwhile, the perpetrator rode off terribly happy about what he'd done, great sort of pride. On the way, he dropped his opium pouch. When he'd ridden to the time of day when he actually needed to take his daily opium, he found that it was missing. And so he threw himself on the ground and was terribly upset, and due course became comatose through lack of opium. The man pursuing found the opium pouch, recognized it, picked it up, rode on, found his enemy, apparently asleep on the ground. He got off his horse to kill him and found that he was, in fact, totally out. And he
Unkillable.
and there is a tremendous sense of honor. Among Rajputs, war is a personal tournament. It is not something, it is cowardly to strike an enemy back. You don't take advantage of an enemy. So he fed the man opium, looked after him like a brother, and only when the man was strong and in proper health again did they fight to the death.
And who won?
History doesn't record.
But I was going to come in with a facetious crack earlier, which is, it seems like you haven't read your Todd, because of course Jawahar Bhai does go out during a Johar and fight, and we don't know the end of. We know the end of that one.
So tell us some more about the arms. So you've been studying specifically Jodhpuri collections.
Well, I did a book for City Palace here a couple of years back, but this is the big one. I started in December 2006, and it's just come out. So it's 2 volumes, and I do warn you all that it's 6.5 kilos. It's impossible to carry away.
You'd never go to the gym again. You just carry your book around.
If you drop it on your foot, you're in trouble. I think the Rajput weapons, when I first arrived, I thought I knew everything about them, and I rapidly found that I didn't. And I was very lucky because I was looked after by nice old Thakur, Hanwek Singh Kandela, who I'm afraid died fairly recently, and he took me to meet various people, and I learned from Thakurs and from collectors and people a great deal. He told a wonderful story about his marriage. He was a very traditional man. He really belonged in the 18th century, and he had been engaged to a woman he'd never met, a girl he'd never met. And he knew that the sisters, one of them was blind, and he didn't know whether he was marrying the blind one or the sighted one. And obviously this was terribly important to him. So when he was sitting on the ground and the bride was processing round him, he gently pushed his sword out in front of him. He knew perfectly well that no well-brought-up Rajput girl would step over his sword, and she halted, and he knew he'd got the sighted one.
And the rituals, that you write about the elaborate rituals associated with weaponry. Is that, again, something specific to this part of the world, or could you find the same rituals in Bengal or with the UP Rajput?
What I think is interesting is the way the Rajputs mirror other horse societies. People who are brought up with an enormous arms tradition and a great horseman tradition don't actually like firearms, and they are obsessed about certain rituals that emphasize their status. There's a huge objection, for instance, Rajputs about guns. They adopt them very reluctantly after the Battle of Kannur when they're defeated by Babur, who uses artillery in a way that is terribly un-Rajput. He actually shoots at them from behind obstacles, which is not what the Rajputs think is an honorable way to behave. But the Rajputs had a rule that if you were wounded by a bullet, you got a certain amount of compensation. If you were wounded by a sword, you got rather more compensation for the same wound.
Sorry, can I jump in there and ask about spears? Because we are talking about swords, and yet you look at paintings, you look at the image of Maharana Pratap, you look at, and they invariably will have a spear. They are taught how to throw spears. They go do pig sticking also. Where does a spear kind of fit into this whole thing of the weapon a Rajput should have, or a warrior should have?
The Trishul.
And the trident, the Trishul, indeed.
Well, you don't see many Trishuls except in the temple up here. It isn't a weapon that is used except really as a symbol. The spear, of course, is an elementary weapon. In the south, the spear can represent the god of the hills in the Tamil country. But I would have said the spear was a distinctly practical object for using from horse, because you have the need of a longer reach.
So, if I can ask a question, I mean, Mughal warfare centered around the horse archer. So archery was a big part of Mughal warfare. The backbone of the Mughal armies used to be the archer. From Mughal accounts, you get the impression that Rajputs specialized in hand-to-hand combat. Is that true? What are the kind of weapons you predominantly find in such collections?
Well, the great weapon of the Central Asia is the four-curved bow, the reflex bow, and you can find them in very early tombs, and it stretches right across to the Chinese border. And the Rajputs appear to use this at an early stage, and then they stop using it. No one's quite sure why, and then it comes back again.
What sort of period does it stop?
I think in about 1300, you would find it was very hard to find the bow represented. It's slightly awkward to carve in sculpture, of course, but you don't really see it. You see what's called the self bow, which is a straightforward bent piece of wood. They do practice. They practice every day. The Rajputs would have a target. It's as though you took a box, filled it with baked earth, and turned it on its side. Often they have wheels, and you can see people practicing on the terrace or at camp. They were expected to use their bow every day and shoot the arrow up to the flights, because it was very good for developing the arm muscles. And the Rajputs trained enormously hard. And I would say that they were never in huge numbers, but their success was based on the fact they trained very hard from childhood.
Rima, you just mentioned Todd. How far do you think he's responsible for creating our modern idea of what a Rajput is?
As long as we're not blaming him, no.
Massively.
Todd has a major role because he is writing at a point where what he writes gets taken into account.
Just explain, in case there's anyone in the room that doesn't know who James Todd is.
And if you haven't, you need to read your Todd just for the sheer delight of some of the stories which come. So a 17-year-old young man who's part of a lot of British East India Company people arrives in India. Exactly, thank you, William. He lands in what is at that point Calcutta, but then he travels. He also travels in the train of the ruler of Gwalior, so he sees the Marathas at close hand. He ends up, at some point, posted in Rajasthan, what he is calling Rajasthan, and we had a little talk about why it's Rajasthan the other day, but he more or less brings into vogue this term, which is still Rajputana, but he starts calling it Rajasthan. But he is all along someone who is part of the administrative network. He kind of progresses as he goes up the hierarchical order, but at the same time, he's a descender. He's dissenting from the thing of, these natives don't know anything, and the ruling group does, and the ruling group, of course, being either the East India Company or the French or whoever else you are against at that point. Todd, like a lot of others of his era, get interested in legends around them, in the art around them. They're also map making at this point, so he does his fair share of that. The reason he becomes larger than life for a lot of people is because he wrote this enormous, you call mine a doorstopper. I have one to replace that, which is a doorstopper, another book. But Todd wrote this 2-volume book, which, in fact, we have Norbert Peabody in the audience now, and he's working on
three people in a row who've all written books about more than 4 inches wide, or the three of you are all responsible for.
Well, we do have Mr. Dalrymple who's guilty of the same, but Todd got there before us because he lived before us. He does this enormous set, 2 volumes, with illustrations, with anything he can lay his hands on, he kind of puts into it. The reason we're mentioning that is he becomes like the encyclopedia for an era. He gets his decisions, or people who are against him, they end up talking about notions of how to deal with Indian states in British Parliament. He's influencing Mill, the senior, I think. Much later, the Bengal school, Tagore, he becomes part of the stories which come in the Rajasthan.
He actually gets sacked, doesn't he? His rival is Oktanoni, who's become a Mughal in Delhi, while Todd has become a Rajput in Rajasthan.
That's probably one of the worst crimes. You know, he's become a Rajput.
And Octoloni sacks him and says he's become too much of a Rajput to deal with the Rajputs.
William, I have a question related to this, to all three of you, which is that when we, in terms of identity formation, when it is talked about, there is this kind of post-Todd and in British historiography of Rajasthan, Kumaraswamy as well, there is this categorization, Rajput equals Hindu, Mughal at the same time equals Muslim, whereas we know that the Mughal court is a very multicultural court, and we know that the Rajput is entirely implicated in the same cultural politics, which are multi-faith. So when it comes to the patronizing of a sword, for instance, what would be the Muslim Rajput rituals that you would study, like you would study the Hindu Rajput rituals associated with the sword? Would they be different? Or when we look at subject matter for painting at about the same time, is there a difference? And is that also not part of that consciousness of their libraries? Or is a Rajput library very distinct in what it chooses to maintain in its...
Asking whether there's such a thing as a Rajput library that's distinct from...
No, is there
Muslim Rajput.
a Muslim Rajput idea, that what is the idea of the Islamic contributions and influence in content rather than in form of line alone, which you would find in painting, but in terms of subject matter, the kind of histories or things that might have been patronized at the Mughal court, are those issues that the Rajput court is not interested in?
Hard to answer that. But I would say there is a parallel between what is happening in Rajasthan and in the, let's say, the Pahadi area, as distinct from the Mughal region. Now, the glory of the kingdom, of the dynasty, etc., which is being celebrated in text after text, right, is both here in Rajasthan as also in the hills, like that and so on. Now, at the Mughal court, I mean, of course, I mean, we have this plethora of texts and so on, which go into the, you know, the great ancestry, the this and that and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question that you are, the observation you're making. But I would see there is a kind of a comparison there, a parallelism between the Rajput kingdoms here of the Rajasthan and in the Pahadi area.
But Naman, when you talk about, you know, the Muslim Rajputs, I think we would then need to also widen the thing and take in what is happening in what is now the Punjab area, because the old Yodhes of, you know, this area are also the Johiyas, who are known both in Rajasthan and in Sindh and Punjab, and now of course in Pakistan. But even earlier than that, you find that when the now Bharatpur, but the Mathura, that area, descendants, they claim to be descendants of Krishna or the old Yaduvanshis. So when they become Muslims, those of them who become Muslims become Khanzadas. So they're still keeping a certain status. And in the weddings, and you know, Shail Mairam has done a lot of work on some of the songs that they have at the weddings. So they have a version of Pandwani that they sing. At their weddings, they will have a mixture of rituals, which is true also of the Qayam Khanis, which would be mostly the kind of Shekhawati part of Rajasthan. Those of you who haven't been there, come there to see the painted Havelis. So there are certain in-between rituals. Painting would be interesting because perhaps that would clash with the notion of, you know, the form being painted. But in terms of literature and the content, it's really borrowing, it's carrying on from an older tradition, which is a more pan-Indian tradition.
Naman, I'd like to take it back to the roots here. You were talking about how so many of the images that we see in Rajput painting derive from early sculpture in this region, from places like Ossian.
Or Khajuraho is the best case study to be able to really look at the form of the Nayakas and the Surasundaris. And then, I mean, many people have talked about it. I can't talk about it in front of Professor Goswamy, really. He should really be answering this question, not me.
Professor Goswamy.
Yeah.
Could you answer the question?
Could you please answer his question? I mean,
how far do we see the painting in this region deriving from what's come out of earlier sculpture in the temples?
I think a great deal, because I had occasion to discuss it with a colleague of mine, and sculpture of the Jain Tirthankaras, for instance, right, have both eyes sort of visible like this. If you turn it around like this and so on, then one eye sort of hangs in the air, right, like that. And
It's very specific Jain style that you see.
Very specific Jain thing and so on. And that is something which becomes a very distinctive way of rendering the eyes in Rajasthani painting, I think.
But other figures that one first sees in sculpture, such as the girl touching the tree and the tree bursting into flower.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you wanted to look for Surasundaris, Nayakas, the whole classification system, which you would want to be able to associate with what you're seeing. If you start studying Ragmalas, or if you then start looking at other poetic manuscripts which are illustrated in Rajasthan, you wouldn't be able to study that iconography without looking at what's going on temple walls. Equally, if you started looking at the imagination of a Ramayana, and how does the Ramayana story move from how it is represented in the narratives on temples to how it is picked up and how that narrative and compositional strategy comes into the painted.
And does one begin with something quite specific in this region? Are the sculptural styles of this region distinct stylistically from those around it? Or could you find exact counterparts to Khajuraho, for example?
The
here?
8th to 12th centuries are particularly difficult to distinguish the styles of Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh areas.
The same figures are being produced in all the different
Because
places.
they're also using the same kind of stone and the same kind of content, subject matter, iconographic texts. It's very hard to be able to take isolated fragments of sculptures and to be able to ascertain with definitiveness and say, this is definitely Jodhpur as opposed to being Bikaner or something. It's very hard.
Quite different to what's the case with the painting by the 18th century, when one can immediately classify a painting as being Jaipur or Mewar or not.
Yeah, no, it is possible to do that. I mean, if a number of paintings are laid in front of me, I would tend to say this is from Amer, Jaipur, or this is Marwar, this is Mewar, this is Bundi, this is Kota, and so on. But these are arbitrary things, because there's a lot of interpenetration. A painter from this particular state goes and works in another state, he doesn't immediately alter his style. So a painter might have been trained in his family, let us say in Mewar, and he starts working in Bikaner or something like this and so on, his style would not immediately change.
But you do get very, very distinct small schools like Kishangarh, which any amateur can immediately say that's a Kishangarh girl because of the length of her eyes.
Yeah, Kishangarh or Kishangarh fakes, I mean, that definitely, there is but it's a very short-lived thing in Kishangarh also, right, like that and so on.
Even in the 18th century, when sort of these Rajput kingdoms were looking towards each other rather than sort of the Mughal tradition, when the period of the Great Alliance between Mewar, Marwar and Amer, and there was a lot of exchange. There's a lot of recording of an exchange of gifts. So they were all exchanging paintings amongst themselves. But their styles stayed true to their original style. It wasn't like that exchange of paintings related to an integration of these different court styles.
Just yesterday, somebody brought up a manuscript to show me.
It's the great thing of your job, sir. No one brings a manuscript to me.
And there were illustrations, 49 illustrations in that manuscript, written fine Devanagari script. And he started asking me, what style is this? And I first thought, I said, this is Pahadi. He says, but are you sure? I said, no, I'm not sure. This looks like Pahadi to me. But this particular detail, the crowns that the Ram and Krishna and Lakshman are wearing come from Bikaner or something like this. Now, it's confusing. It's not inauthentic, that particular manuscript. It is dated 1794 or something like that. So what I'm saying is interpenetration of styles does take place. One of the things that I'm very struck by is how many Muslim painters were working at Rajasthani courts. Is completely unlike what happens in the Pahadi area. There are lots of Muslims there, and only one Muslim painter is known. Name of one Muslim painter in the 19th century is known.
And again, the same is true, another subject we haven't touched on, the music, that you get the Langar Manganyas, Muslims singing Hindu devotional music as their main
Look what's
source
happening
of expression.
in Mewar. I mean, Sahib Deen and Company, Bikaner, Rukunuddin, and so on and so forth.
But you also
so
have a
there
great
is
many...
a very easy accept... Sorry?
Sorry, please.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, you also have a large number of Muslims serving in the Rajput armies from very early on. And in fact, in Akbar's siege of Chittor, there's a Muslim leading a Rathore contingent. There's the best shot in Chittor defending is a Rajput, is a Muslim, and Simon Digby brings this out very well. Actually, the thing is far more. It hasn't got the divisions that we were perhaps taught at school to believe existed. Doesn't exist.
We're actually coming back to what makes Rajasthan or Rajput or whatever. And as you say about what are we getting from different music or something like that. So you also have Langas and Manganyar. So you have a group that is practicing Islam, but their patrons are Hindus, and they're practicing Islam, their patrons are Muslims, but when they sing, the analogy will be, I can hear the sound at Mathura of the striking of the drum because Krishna has been born. But in this case, they're talking about the birth of a child at their patron's house. So, we kind of go back to identity formation.
But it's about tolerance, partly about tolerance, isn't it?
It works the other way around also. You have instances of, like for example, Mahabat Khan. I mean, his sort of coup of his house arrest of Jahangir. I mean, his soldiers were all Rajputs. And there's that wonderful anecdote in which sort of Jahangir complains, oh, just remove all these savages, these beetle nut chewing savages. Why are they keeping guard over me? So there was, I mean, the military labor market was very fluid, and it wasn't as if, sort of Rajputs were serving in Rajput's army and Muslims were serving in Mughal armies. The Mughal army was very heterogeneous. And the Mughal court and Mughal culture was very heterogeneous, and also a lot of Muslims served in Rajput courts.
Naman, we've got time for 5 more minutes. Would you touch on one thing we haven't touched so far, on these early 15th, 14th century texts from this region, which are very important in the early development of Hindi literature? We've got 5 minutes.
Well, for several years, I've been trying to teach a course on Sultanate period painting. And in the course of studying and trying to teach that group of paintings, we all come up with the canon of the early period of Hindi literature, which comprises the Chandayan, the Mrigavat, the Hansavali, and Padmavat. and we always look at how these texts are absorbed, how oral law is canonized for the first time, why it's not possible to be able to study Hindi literature without knowing the Arabic script. The earliest, all of these stories, when they are put down, you have to know your Persian to be able to read Avdhi, to be able to read Braj.
Just to make this clear, early classics of Hindi literature written in the Persian script.
Yes, because the patrons whose libraries these books ended up in were the early sultans of Mandu and Jaunpur. And they had aspirations to libraries like the way people in Shiraz and Isfahan had libraries. They too wanted libraries, and so it becomes a complex story to be able to see. So these texts are included in their custody and for them to be able to read in their script. But the language isn't Farsi. And that makes it quite interesting to be able to see what elements get incorporated in those texts, in the telling of those texts, and how they might have changed at that time. And there is a very rich history of how these texts have transformed. in their various oral recensions and at the time when they were canonized and put down in these libraries at Mandu and in Jaunpur. So, what was your question?
But later on you have manuscripts which are again in two scripts, Devanagari and Farsi. But just to go back to some of the earlier ones, in the 14th century you have, and now I remember the name, I was trying to think of it, we have Padmanabh's Kanharde Prabandh, which is in what was at that time, if I remember my tessitory, Western, Rajasthani, which doesn't exist, but that text is now part of the Gujarati curriculum in Gujarat, because that's what the language is. There is still, Rajasthani is not a language of the Indian constitution even now, but that old Western Rajasthani equals old Western Gujarati, and the text there is actually talking about the attack of Alauddin Khilji, who we know did attack everywhere, so predictably there are a lot of texts of that time. But this is in the script and the, not Dhundari, no, it's, well, partly because of where it is. But Kanharde Prabandh then becomes this major little classical work, which is a historical novella also, but it is being used. And when you were talking about being written for the rulers of Mandu and all, a lot of them and the other mini patrons, the aristocrats, some of whom did have non-Arabic and non-Turkish origins, and so they were sons of the soil, and would perhaps have related equally to the main storyline being told of local people. And so the oral tradition is actually talking about Hindu, Muslim, mixed warriors who are often fighting each other, and that oral tradition then gets written down much later in the Baat, Khyat become part of the Raso tradition, much later.
BNG, one last question to you about the Rajputs going out and fighting for the Mughals. So, for example, the Maharaja of Bundi going off and taking service with Jahangir, Shah Jahan, but then coming back and in Bundi commissioning wall paintings which are quite different to anything that he would have seen in the Mughal sphere. What's going on there? What's going on there when you have effectively Mughal generals coming back home to Bundi and commissioning quite different artworks?
Yeah, it's a question of dispersal of styles. One style having an impact upon the other. Now, Bikaner, for instance, the Deccan school has a great influence on Bikaner because the Karan Singh fought there and so on.
And brought back manuscripts he'd looted from the Deccan.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this kind of thing, I think we don't realize it enough, but this kind of a give and take did take place at fairly large scale. And I'm struck by one other detail which has nothing to do with the question you're asking. And that is that a number of these texts, the Sufi texts, were written with Hindu themes, written by Muslims. Laur Chanda, Mullah Dawood, Padmavat by Malik Muhammad Jayasi, right? This particular thing by Kavi Manjan and so on. They're all Muslims, Hindu themes, all written by Muslims at the time when transitions were taking place. Now, Sikh Leaguers, for instance, they were all Muslims, right? Making things for Hindu patrons.
Yes.
Yeah? Every Sikh Leaguer, I think, was, as far as I know.
Well, the best arrow makers, all the arrow makers in Jodhpur were Muslims, for example. You have Muslims making a great many weapons and things. There's no awkwardness about it, it just happens. But I was very interested to find that the court ritual language in Jodhpur was Persian, but it had been so Mawariized, if I can put it that way, that the local people in the fort didn't realize that it was actually Persian, and they corrected it I put it in Persian, and they said, no, you're not writing this correctly. This is how we do it here.
So just to be facetious for half a second, I do have my eye on the clock. Gandhar Museum, 1997. The pure assistant curator, who never used to get called up to talk to the VIPs, was sitting in his room and we had to go in and see the place, and he was pretty morose at that point. And he used to spend his time carving on the grey Gandharan local schist. He was carving scenes, he's told us, he pulled open his drawer, And his work was all scenes from the Ramayana or the Ram Leela, or however you want to take it, whether it's Ramcharitmanas, but basically scenes of Ram and Krishna being made in modern day Peshawar Museum. And I just thought to myself, if a curator finds this, they're going to say, you know what? They only talk about Gandhar and Buddhist art. Here we have this stuff. It's all Hindu art. Who made it? The curators wouldn't be that dumb, I know. But it just makes an interesting story of how much we cross borders and border lines.
This is a session that could go on for much longer. Sadly, we have reached the 000 point on our timer. So I think we maybe, as there's no one coming in afterwards, we can still have a few minutes for questions, if anyone's got one. This lady had a hand up first. We have a microphone.
I have a question on the non-wartime, peacetime ceremonial usage of weapons. For example, in Dasera, Kshatriyas used to worship it. And also, for example, tradition like a chain mail being used at, ceremonials in the army today, So could you comment on that?
I didn't hear that very well.
Dasera and ceremonial uses of weapons,
Yes.
and chain mail,
Yes.
does that get used for any ceremonial purpose?
The same weapons are used for worshipped that are later used in battle. It's just the same as the taxi driver wanting to get the goddess to enter his taxi to make it give him a better year. That is the case. There are very, very large swords in the armory, weigh a huge amount, and it was always considered that these were used to take the head of a buffalo in Dashera. But in fact, I don't believe that. There are far too many. And you also have chaddi, you have maces that are used, which cannot be used for taking head of a buffalo. I think the Rajputs trained incredibly hard. If you look at the weights they used, they really practiced very hard. And they therefore were able to deal with these enormous weapons. And of course, it was very important to take the head off in one go. So the weapon you would carry around, to some extent, would be the weapon you would use in war until you get to the Mughal courts. Once you're in the Mughal courts, the Rajputs adopt Mughal costume and Mughal swords, but they don't carry them in battle when they get home. They dump them pretty quickly and go back to the true and trusty blade that they know.
Hello.
Yeah,
Good evening to all.
the small girl in front here.
I just have a very simple question. That does Rajasthan belong to a place of royal lineage or in a wider sense?
I think we've established that, Rajasthan consists of numerous different communities. Certain communities historically might have been dominant, but obviously what constitutes the unique identity of Rajasthan is the existence of all these different communities which are distinctive to Rajasthan and the intercaste links that have historically existed between these different communities.
In the front here. One last question here.
Small girl.
The small girl.
Hello. So we've talked about labor fluidity and military fluidity and syncretism, and during the age when art is very important for a court to politically assert itself, do we see any instances of a court standing in contradistinction to the art of a neighboring court or a rival court to make a political statement?
Is art being produced in a state of competition where courts are competing with each other?
One up.
To have a sense of one-upmanship or to show their distinctiveness? Yes, it exists, definitely. There is a requirement to be able to establish your own identity, whether it is in any period. It tends to happen. Art style and architectural style is very much a quest to be able to show some kind of a regional impress of that particular family, that particular gharana, or that particular set of rulers. So courts do try and develop their own distinctive flavor and identity, and that allows us a frame of reference to be able to study them.
And Naman Chittor's Kirti Stham and Chittor's Vijay Stham, both of which were called Kirti Stham back then. It's only we've now called them. They kind of don't necessarily fit into an architectural, pan-India vocabulary, but they exist. So it is definitely one-upmanship there. That same ruler who puts up the Victory Tower makes 32 out of the 82 forts of Mewar. He does it for a practical reason, but he adds his own touch to that.
I think on a more mundane level, I could tell you that from the 16th century, the various rulers designed their own pugs, their own turbans. They had their own sword hilts, other articles of costume. They're named after them. The great problem is that as the centuries pass, you can't remember whether you have rulers with the same name. And so you can't know if the sword hilt relates to the first one in Udaipur, the one in Bikaner, whatever. So they get rather lost, and collectors use them today most inaccurately. But the individuality in the court was very important because you weren't allowed into the court till the chamberlain inspected you and seen that you were wearing the appropriate clothing. And this was to show your allegiance to the ruler of the day. So on a very mundane level, I don't think sword hilts are necessarily art, but it is this identity. And you get different hilts relating to different courts. But later on, of course, if you happen to be in Jodhpur and you say that you want a Jaipur-style hilt, they'll make it for you. Of course they will. And it gets very muddled. And then they're the captured weapons, and you have to remember that the hilts are changed all the time. So it does become very, very complicated. The other thing that's really interesting is after the Battle of Panipat, when the Marathas are defeated, of course, there was a vast amount of scrap metal on the battlefield, weapons abandoned. And the question is, what does that do to design work in northern India? You can see that the Afghans would carry a certain amount of stuff. They had a huge number of horses, huge number of slaves.
300,000 killed that day? How many? Something?
One of the bloodiest battles.
So I'm afraid, we've overshot the time already. We've already overshot the time. Thanks a lot for this wonderful session presented by Avid Learning. And I'm really very sorry to cut short, but we've overshot the time. We wish to thank our sponsor, Zee Jaipur Literature Festival, powered by AU Small Finance Bank, Zee Title Partner, powered by Venue Partners, Bank of Baroda, Cox & Kings, Rajan Kilachan, Amity University, Jaipur, Rajasthan Tourism, Tanishq, Course Partner, Dettol Banega Swachh India, British Council, Dove, Nokia 8, Assam Tourism, Penguin, Airtel, Kindle Direct Publishing, iStart, Getty Foundation, Mahindra World City, Airtel Telecom Partner, The Singleton, Kingfisher, Grover Zampa, SBI, Media Partners, Dainik Bhaskar, DainikBhaskar.com, Rajasthan Patrika, Red FM, The Telegraph, Matribhumi, Facebook and Twitter.